Good morning and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's webinar series, or next installment in the webinar series called ESG. Today's webinar is entitled Sustainability and Climate Change. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you, John. And I thank you. On your behalf, I thank all the members and people with the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce. It's a great pleasure being here to moderate this incredible panel with these very important people in the field of sustainability, ESG, and climate change. It is truly a great pleasure being here. And I hope you that are joining us today will also enjoy our panel. Paula, how do we engage the top executives of an energy company into an ESG-oriented culture? What does that mean in practical terms, in your view, Paula?
I think that's a very good question, because when I started that journey inside Cosan maybe 3 years ago, I would say it was a lot tougher than it would be today, with everyone talking about ESG or understanding what exactly ESG means. And it's not to say that there was no sustainability consciousness in Cosan, not at all. I think it's the opposite. You know, we've always been obsessed with security. We've always been the ones trying to push for the development of ethanol in Brazil and investing in infrastructure to make, you know, agribusiness more competitive and so on and so forth. But I think the whole idea that all of a sudden financial market discovered this as a theme, right? And then moved forward into somehow creating parameters for those things to be measured. I think there was an amazing shift in the perception, or on the belief that environmental was only risk management. Environmental was something that you have to watch to have a license to operate, to be able to continue with their business going forward. And the biggest change to me is this has become a business opportunity. And that's really where, you know, I think executives click, and I mean, I think that's what would turn this whole movement sustainable, in the sense that that's a global trend. That's what society wants. That's what you know, investors want. That's what everyone is, you know, growing more conscious about the importance. And therefore, this is what's going to drive, you know, the value of brands, consumer willingness to purchase, and, you know, pricing and what have you.
Focusing on this opportunity, what do you see as some of the real and concrete benefits of being perceived as a social environmental responsible corporations, since you're exercising a very important mandate to that area in a very important energy corporation?
Today, when we see the market progressing, we see more sense in terms of having a benefit of being perceived as a social environmental responsible company. Access to capital, for instance, the capitals are becoming very selective. And if you don't have a sustainable, a strong programming project that makes sense in terms of carbon and emission reduction, you're going to find a lot of difficulties to progress huge projects in the future.
Well, you know, there's 1.2 trillion US of green bonds outstanding in the world now, including Paula's $500 million one. So we've seen a lot of it, and the greenwashing is pretty minor. There's only been one scam in the markets so far, and that was by a Syracuse, New York property developer in 2009. It was an American, not the Nigerians, not the Mexicans, not the Brazilians. It was an American who got a green bond tax credit under an earlier Obama administration piece of regulation, chose not to bother doing the retrofitting of the shopping center, and went ahead. There was an investigation by a journalist and eventually by the Inland Revenue Service, and they found that under legislation, they only had to promise that they need to actually do? Well, we're doing a little bit better in the $1.2 trillion green bond market. People not only have to promise, they have to do. They have to report at the end of each year. Now, is it legally binding? At the moment, in most jurisdictions, excluding China and excluding the EU next year, you don't. You could decide to just do what you want. But we're talking about bond issuers here. I think it's going to be unlikely that Kazan is going to mess up their investors, because the next bond afterwards is going to be very, very difficult to get away. And I can remember one of the first bond issuer in Hong Kong, property developer, he said to me afterwards, green bond issuer, he said to me afterwards, Sean, look, I know it's voluntary, but I just want you to know, the day after I issued my green bond, the major investors took me to lunch and they sat me around the table and they said, look, we love your green bond. It's fantastic. It was a good green bond. And they said, but you've got to deliver on this, right? Otherwise we will screw you. That was the language they used. And that's how bond markets work. You know, there's a hell of a lot of self-policing that goes on necessarily, and it works. So when people talk about greenwashing, they're not talking about people promising to do it and then not doing it, because that's something, frankly, you don't get. And we monitor at Client Bonds every single green bond issued on the planet. There have been about 10,000 so far. We track them. What we do get, though, is arguments about what can be called green.
2.5 years ago, my first conversations with the banks were, okay, you want to issue a green bond for a railway company? Are you planning to electrify the railway? So we started there, okay, to then, you know, teaching them through the dynamic of a country like Brazil, where you have no infrastructure whatsoever, and you have to invest to have the train, and then the train substitutes the truck. And because you're substituting the truck, in fact, your carbon footprint reduction is way bigger than the carbon footprint reduction that we actually ended up committing to issue the bond, because there's no taxonomy yet. And I think that's something for every one of us to think about. There's no taxonomy yet to that kind of contribution, the avoided carbon. You know, I wonder if at some point we'll be able to call it a negative scope 3 or something like this, but I think that's essentially what it is, right? But at the end of the day, we ended up committing to a 15% reduction in the carbon footprint of our locomotives. We successfully issued the green bond. The role of the CBI was essentially to be very transparent and help us understand the taxonomy, which at the end of the day helped us get the certifiers to agree with the taxonomy or with the case for green bond that we were putting together. And it wasn't an easy task, to be very honest. And that's why we think the transparency and the, you know, all the information about the taxonomy was so helpful, and also helped us reduce a little bit the cost of the certification, by the way, because we know what we wanted to do. But the good news is not only we issued the first green bond, but we recently issued a sustainability linked debenture in Brazil, in which we anticipated the 15% reduction target from 2025 to 2023.
How has this ESG process affected how lawyers and third parties put together ESG related securities offerings?
The starting place for all of this is people's mentality has to change. Now, I know there's some political pockets that don't necessarily think climate change is important, and maybe my politics I'm wearing on my sleeve, but I think the real trend that was really critical to, in fact, how these deals get done and how lawyers can help is getting societies across various countries to understand that there needs to be some change. In the early days, when we first saw a few green bonds, I agree with Paul and others, it was aspirational at best. There was no real consequence. You could say whatever you want. And I think some people generally put out statements that they would hope to achieve some ESG compliance or some ESG benefits in their business, but there really wasn't much teeth in it. I do think what's changed over the last 4 years in the US, particularly as there's been a great debate about climate change, and it's a political debate here as well, is I think there's a great realization amongst society here that there needs to be a change. And again, the current administration is very committed to that. The former administration was less committed, but investors speak with their dollars or their pesos or their euros. And we are definitely seeing a great interest across the market in investors wanting to see some change. So it doesn't really matter what the politics are, whether it's in Brazil or the US, doesn't matter. What really matters is what investors want. And we're seeing very clearly with Sean's help and others that investors want to see change. They maybe not massive change. They don't want to see, Petrobras stop being the company that it is, but they want to see some awareness that climate conditions and climate control needs to be something that's part of their overall business. And what's been very rewarding the last 4 or 5 years has been an exponential increase in awareness by companies, whether it's the IR department or just the CFO or Treasury department, that this has to be part of how companies across Latin America in particular look at their business.
I just wanted to add, I've just come off of a G20 panel where this is the topic du jour, where most of the speakers were talking about green finance and taxonomies. And we're talking about countries all around the world being involved in this. We're going to see a lot of movement of this because this is a way that governments can see to fast track understanding amongst the finance sector and about other parties about what needs to be done, what they need to be done to meet the commitments that they've now made. Let's not underestimate these commitments. 18 months ago, 2 countries in the world are committed to 2050 net zero targets. We now have 112 countries that are committed. At the Biden Climate Summit, all the major economies committed to pretty ambitious 2030 targets. That's 9 years out. Now, none of them know how they're going to do it. None of them. They know bits of it. They know about clean energy. They know about avoided deforestation, but they don't know yet what they're going to do in the other energy spaces. They're trying to figure out. The International Energy Agency came out with a report today, which is modeling for the 1.5 degree Paris climate change agreement target and essentially meeting the 2030 target, because this 2030 target was promulgated by the IPCC in 2018 with their 1.5 degree report. And they've said some very clear things. They've said, and this is going to be challenging for Roberto's company, they've said that we need to phase out all inefficient coal in OECD countries by 2030. We need to phase out all gas-fired power in OECD countries by 2035. And then we need to move in emerging markets soon after. So it means that if you're doing a gas investment in a rich country like the US, well, according to the IEA, if it's got a lifespan longer than 15 years, it shouldn't be there. If it's in an emerging market, if it's got a lifespan of more than 20 years, it shouldn't be there. So let's just say that's what the science is saying. Now, will governments enact this? Well, the first thing they're going to act is, if it's in a green universe, it's going to get some preferencing. It's going to get some support, some capital market support, and so on. And if it's in a brown universe, you can expect the pressure to increase and increase and increase. It's a risk. It's a risk of pressure. But there's other pressures too, because as governments choose to promote investments to count, let's like China's doing electric vehicles now. They are investing, they're forcing investment in electric vehicles. We expect in the next 18 months, electric vehicle capex on average to be lower than petrol-based cars. So around the world, that's going to be an inflection point. Already OPEX is cheaper. In Germany last year, 50% of all cars sold to fleet managers were electric because the OPEX is cheaper. Now, think about the risk of oil in this equation, because you only need a small amount of reduction in demand in oil to see prices go back down, not go back up. So there's a risk. Everything's a risk, right? We're bankers and finance people here. So there's a reasonable risk now that we're going to see significant disruption, or at least is what the central bankers are telling me, in the those auto companies that are not shifting, and the oil industry and the gas industry, green hydrogen. We expect to be cheaper than methane gas, natural gas, within 10 years globally for a variety of reasons. Now, at that point in 10 years' time, if you're going to buy molecules in a gas, would you buy green hydrogen or would you buy natural gas that's got a license to operate problem?
Buy green from ethanol.
Or green from ethanol. Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I agree with you on that.
Even green hydrogen if you want.
So for fossil fuel, it's a problem.
Yeah.
But, generating green hydrogen, there's a business opportunity. Generating bio avgas there's a business opportunity for the ethanol industry. These things are going to happen, and they're going to happen faster than we can blink. And that's why investors are now really interested in the taxonomy, because it becomes a guide to what is going to survive, which is a risk for investors.
If I may here quickly, I think there's another important differentiation that needs to be made, and which is to acknowledge the social or the macroeconomic situation, or the natural vocation of each country, if you like, right? So if you take Brazil as an example, and we're not denying the electrification of Europe, right? Not at all, make no mistake. But there is a solution in Brazil, which is the first for horizon zero, if you like, which is the 100% hydrated ethanol car, which even in Brazil, where we have 83% of power generation being renewable, the ethanol engine is less pollutant than even the electric car, the electric vehicle, if you consider all the emissions from, the manufacturing all the way to charging, generating the energy that charges the car. And then in the longer term, I think there's a chance, the ethanol becomes an amazing source of green hydrogen, as you mentioned. And that can be combined, for example, with all the natural gas that Petrobras is likely going to produce, even more coming from the pre-salt and so on and so forth. So my point here is not necessarily the energy transition in Brazil needs to be similar to the energy transition proposed for Europe. First, because we don't have the budget to make the investment. Let's be honest here. There's a bunch of other priorities for the country in the short and mid-term, to say the least. But second, because there is a solution that works, and that we can create a transition that is probably not only the ethanol, but a combination of ethanol blended into gasoline. I mean, our gasoline is already cleaner than the gasoline that is used in the US and other countries. So we have the advantage of creating our own transition, right? To a point where eventually, and that's my very personal view, Brazil is going to jump from ethanol into hydrogen without necessarily going through the so-called, I mean, the cell fuel is also a battery, but not necessarily going through the EV as people know as EV, okay? And I think that's a very important advantage that the country has. And therefore, we have to leverage on that advantage as opposed to trying, I mean, there's no one solution fits all if we are to reach the Paris Agreement, right? So I think we have to really think about all those alternatives, considering the reality of each country.
We have a simple rule: don't overpromise and underdeliver. That's the problem with this. You need to educate people about this. And we put on panels, we talk to IR people, we talk to people in various subgroups within companies all the time about what trends we're seeing, who's issuing an ESG bond, what the standards are, what the penalties are. We, very often as lawyers get asked to sort of play banker and help people understand what the trend is. But the real counsel advice is, please, if you want to go into this world, the ESG world in any way, please understand that you can't do it just as getting a stamp. It's not literally getting what used to be called in the US a good stamp, housekeeping, a good housekeeping stamp of approval. It's not something you just do on the side and get a stamp and move on. This has to be a strong commitment, and your IR people have to be very educated. Maybe, Paula is a perfect example of the perfect person who really understands this, but the IR team, which talks to investors, has to really understand the trends and what's reasonable and what's realistic within the next, 8 or 9 years. You go out to 2030, for example. But we tell people all the time, please be careful. Understand what you're talking about. Make sure you can have people explain it well. Don't overpromise, and then, God help us, do not underdeliver, because at some point investors are going to wake up, like Sean mentioned at that lunch. They're going to say, maybe they won't say they'll screw you, but they'll say something to that effect, and that's not good for a company to hear from investors. I'm sure Paula would agree. You don't want your investors to be annoyed and decide that they're not interested, or they, more importantly, think that the company is not believable. So our number one rule when we talk to people is help educate them about the trends, but please help understand what we're seeing other companies do, and make sure that if you're going into this world that you have some commitment, because it's not the sort of thing that we think you can do sort of off on the side. So when I hear, get the stamp, I'm thinking, if I heard that from an executive, I would say, okay, we're going to need to educate you right now. It's not about getting a stamp. Okay, it's not about a stamp of approval. It's about how are you going to factor this into your business? Is it reasonable for you to engage in this activity without completely changing the nature of your business or the profitability for your shareholders and your other constituencies? But please don't think of it as a stamp. Think of it as a ongoing, maybe lifetime commitment of a company going forward.
John, thank you also for putting this together, and once again for the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce for hosting this important conversation. That, I'll hand it over to you, John.
Very good. Thank you, Romulo. Thank you, Paulo, Robert, Stuart, and Sean for an excellent discussion. And thank you all for joining. Our next event is a webinar on disruptor companies set for the 25th of May at 10 a.m. Please keep an eye on the website because there may be things coming in and out as we go along. And again, thank you all for coming, especially to our members. For those that are not, please watch the brief video that follows, and we invite you to join the chamber. In the meantime, please stay healthy and in good spirits.